Coming to you now from our downtown studio, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. I'd like to tell you right at the top of the show here today that the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the staff, management, or underwriters of KYRS Thin Air Community Radio. And thank you for joining me today. My goodness, I've just discovered the most horrifying thing reading the press this week. The U.S. is losing the propaganda wars, or so they say. My goodness, this is bad. We're losing the battle for the hearts and minds of the world. Well, no, that's not quite right. The U.S. is failing to convince the world, with the exception of Americans, of the inherent untruths and misrepresentations with which it continues to justify its actions to its own citizens and a few foreign heads of state who are already inclined to listen to this nonsense. And it must be true. It must be true. I read it in the news, in the U.S. news, Reuters, which is not technically a U.S. company, but it passes for U.S. news. It's a friendly force. The U.S. is being beaten by the information pouring out of, you'll never guess, wait for it, Russia. Yep. This happens all the time. Russia always ends up outgunning the U.S. You know, they did it in the 50s with the bomber gap, but there was a bomber gap. It was in the favor of the U.S. And then there was the missile gap, much touted by President John Kennedy, which was about how there was this enormous gap in missiles in the 1960s. And indeed, there was a missile gap in the 60s. It was 10-1 in the U.S. favor. But here we have a threat. We must take this one seriously, just because we've been so hideously mistaken or just lying through our teeth so many times in the past. Here's another threat that's going to require more money to fix. Lots and lots of more money. Now, there's a group called the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and this is an agency that was created in 1994, which was supposed to firewall the State Department and the government from news operations that the government also runs. But, you know, here we have credible press, which I've reported on in the past on this show, that the CIA and others continue to bribe journalists domestically and foreign, that the U.S. is constantly tweaking the information that is being put out in the news press. Now, they don't have to do that in the U.S., which is a good thing. Not very often anyway. I mean, there's the odd Judith Miller case. But, you know, generally, and of course there were a couple of people in the Bush administration who were being handed wads of cash to write favorable articles about Bush programs and such. But generally it doesn't happen as much as it used to when hundreds, literally hundreds of American reporters worked at some relationship with the CIA and other intelligence agencies just to make sure the right stories got out, you know. So the BBG was set up to stop all that. Well, it really hasn't over much, but we'll pretend it does. It has an annual budget of $730 million, and it runs the U.S. government broadcasts to foreign audiences. This includes radio, TV, digital media, the whole ball of wax. So this is players like the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And these are widely touted by the BBG and others with countering Soviet influence behind the Iron Curtain, bringing people the truth. And, when you live in a place where the news is suppressed or tweaked or propagandized, it's always nice to get outside sources. That's why I rely so often on the foreign press. It is indeed useful. So, maybe Radio Liberty and Radio Europe did some good. Radio Free Europe did some good over there and just presenting other viewpoints and maybe even some hard news now and again. But there is a report that was written about the operation of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and they asked some people to assess the system and its service. So they talked to 30 foreign policy and public diplomacy types. Anyway, here's what they found out, quoting Reuters now. Quoting Reuters. The study is the latest to highlight problems in the Broadcasting Board of Generals. The new report, quote, calls for strengthening in U.S. counter-propaganda efforts and an overhaul of the government's international broadcasting arm. Strengthening our counter-propaganda efforts, because when we do it, it's not propaganda, it's counter-propaganda. You gotta love Reuters. It does not advocate turning government-funded broadcasters into instruments of U.S. propaganda. No. We're just doing counter-propaganda. That's different. But it argues that the political firewall separating them, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, separating them from U.S. national security agencies is, quote, overblown, and that broadcasters are not always in tune with U.S. foreign policy objectives. I mean, you talk about some corporate speak. Bob, you're no longer in tune with our foreign policy objectives. We're going to disappear you and send you to a strange place where you'll never be seen from again. It's got that edge to it. Dear. Not in tune. Anyway. Competitors, quote, competitors with anti-U.S. messaging are fomenting an information war and winning, while U.S. international broadcasting is challenged to keep pace with competitors and changes in the media landscape. U.S. international communications strategy should be rebuilt from the ground up, quoting the report here, as revealed in Reuters. So, what are the great issues where the U.S. is being outgunned? Well, it's mainly with Russia. Again, Russia. Why do you do this to us all the time? You make us look bad. And we're just trying to be a small, little, competent empire, expanding its sphere of influence. And, or as Ledeen called it, the sphere of democracy. That's what we're about. You betcha. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. Russia, particularly the Ukraine crisis, which was referred to in the report as, quote, the most serious challenge U.S. international broadcasting has faced since the fall of the Soviet Union. Our nation, this is Ed Royce, House Foreign Affairs Committee, chairperson, our nation is getting beat by Putin propaganda, and our international broadcasting is floundering. It's unacceptable. You bet. So anyway, Royce, he's a Republican from California, sponsored legislation to reform the Broadcasting Board of Governors. And he issued his statement just after the most recent CEO of the BBG, a guy named Andrew Lack, who was on the job for a whole of 6 weeks, returned to NBC News, where he had been president from 1993 to 2001. Now, am I the only person who is a little concerned that NBC News and the Broadcast Board of Governors could be a very seamless sort of transition? It suggests that the firewall may not be as secure as it was intended to be if you can just move transparently between these two positions. And I don't know why Andrew Lack only stayed for 6 weeks on the job. If anybody stumbles over that in any credible source, please feel free to email me the story. So they have expanded, though. They've added 25 programs, mostly in Russian, since Russia moved into Crimea in February. So Russia's the enemy. Russia's the big enemy. Russia's the enemy we have to counter. Not the Taliban, not Al-Qaeda in the Iraq Peninsula, not Daesh. It's Russia. Russia, Russia, Russia. And you can understand why they're concerned about Russia, because they've got some news agencies, RT in particular, which is sort of their flagship, which is making major inroads, not just internationally, but in the U.S. as well. RT's widely available. It's widely watched. They have poached such names as Larry King to do shows. They have smart, bright reporters from native English backgrounds who do some very, very good shows, very, very good news. But, this is an uneven playing field, says Mr. Trimble, a very uneven playing field in the battle to inform and influence populations in Russia and its periphery, by which we mean Ukraine. Russia has blocked, this is Reuters, Russia has blocked U.S. government broadcasts and spends a reported $400 million to $500 million a year on foreign information efforts. The United States spends about $20 million annually on Russian language services. Here's Reuters at its very best, really. You talk about a false comparison. So Russia spends $400 to $500 million a year on its information efforts, but the U.S. is only spending $20 million annually on Russia. But what is the U.S. annual overall budget, which would then be an apt comparison to the $400 to $500 million the Russians are spending? Well, the U.S. annual budget is $750 million. So the U.S. is outspending Russia in its information efforts, and yet it's failing at them. And the only excuse the Americans can come up with is to say, there's no money. We're Liechtenstein against what the Russians are spending. Liechtenstein against what the Russians are spending? Seriously? And this was from a Western diplomat who follows the issue closely and spoke on the condition of anonymity. So here you go. I mean, this is the organization, the BBG, which has produced such stellar programming as Radio Marti. Radio Marti, that broadcasts into Cuba, or at least it used to. I presume it still will, at least until we engineer the coup that removes Cuba, now that we can have an embassy there again. So we got a couple of things here. First of all, the U.S. is being outgunned. It's a question of money. And the U.S. appears to be producing shows which really aren't making the impact that it would like them to make. Or they're lying about that too, because they don't actually present any evidence and material that I've seen. They're just saying the Russians are outgunning us, they're outgunning us. And what they mean is they're seeing Russian TV here. That's what's freaking them out. People are actually starting to talk about what they've seen on RT. That's what's freaking them out. It's also curious to note that the U.S. only appears weak when it wants to expand its power and influence. And then whoever wants to grow their department budget whines about how underfunded they are and how this is hurting America and blah, 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 blah. We all know the story. But Radio Marti, I was surprised to know that Radio Marti is still in operation. Radio Marti is a study. It's often cited in communication textbooks as a study in the abject failure and incompetence of propaganda efforts. One of their plans to beam TV into Cuba was to fly blimps over southern Florida and broadcast that 90 miles down to Cuba where people could view it. Apparently nobody told them about the weather in southern Florida, which is not necessarily blimp-friendly weather. A lot of thunderstorms, a lot of wind, a lot of hurricanes, and all kinds of things. they did things like deciding that to counter Cuban jamming of these propaganda broadcasts, they would broadcast late at night between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, I think it was, apparently not realizing that the Cubans might well be asleep then and there wouldn't be much of an audience to get. But there's another dimension to this too, which goes to the uses of propaganda. Propaganda has been well studied, well examined. There's stacks of books on it, everybody from Walter Lippmann to Jacques Ellul to Ed Bernays has written on propaganda. And everybody generally admits the Americans really have it down when it comes to propaganda. The Nazis studied American propaganda. But here's the thing about propaganda. A couple of the things we know about it is that it works best on the people who write it. Propaganda works best on the people who write propaganda, who already believe it. So propaganda is generally very bad at changing people's opinions, but it's very good at reinforcing what people already believe. And there's a word for this. We call it confirmation bias. People already believe something, you give them evidence that supports it. Aha, I was right. Propaganda is actually very good at doing that, but it doesn't change people's minds. So this report says that the general consensus is that change would not be sufficient. Change would not be sufficient. And they're right. You know, the problem is more fundamental with the Board of Governors. The problem is much more fundamental. You know, at least we've got the NSA and the Five Eyes Consortium, you know, to find out how little the rest of the world believes our lies. At least we have that. We can continue to arrest and imprison and hound whistleblowers for revealing truth about what's going on in the world. Snowden, Assange, Manning, Kiriakou, all those other people who risk their lives and give up their freedom to bring forth the truth, which undermines the deceptions that perpetuate the eternal war, which perpetuate the unending lists of enemies, old and new, Russia and Daesh, and all of which necessitates, of course, larger and more lethal devices, and the operations where they can be deployed to kill more people. So change, just some change in the Broadcast Board of Governors, is not going to fix anything at all. But if you look at what they're doing, look at the nature of propaganda and the nature of what they think news is and the underlying beliefs, and we can tease out the theories that are working here. And, well, let me just go to the Director of Central Intelligence for this one. This is from Fifth Column News, republished in Mint Press, and this is a quote from John Brennan, who's Director of CIA. If I look across the board in terms of since 9/11 at terrorist organizations, I hope he didn't really write a sentence that badly. If I look across the board in terms of since 9/11 at terrorist organizations, and if the United States in all of its various forms, in intelligence, military, homeland security, law enforcement, and diplomacy, if we were not as engaged against the terrorists, I think we would be facing a horrendous environment, because they would have taken full advantage of the opportunities that they have had across the region. Oh my gosh, that is spooky, isn't it? If we hadn't engaged against the terrorists. This is so spooky, but this really misses the point. As, you know, we stumble around the Middle East, and DCIA seems completely unaware that every time we go somewhere, it falls apart and it creates all of these opportunities, as he put it, for terrorists. Quoting the article now, it is as if he refuses to recognize the fact that the U.S. ousting of Saddam Hussein created a power vacuum in Iraq, or that the U.S. policy of arming radical Islamic elements in Syria created the force to fill that power vacuum by creating the Islamic State. When governments fail, they create power vacuums. It happens. There's no way that they don't create power vacuums, and people do move into those gaps. So back to the DCIA here, for example. Talks about working very hard to root out the terrorists. Quote, might some of these actions be stimulants to others joining their ranks? Sure, that's a possibility, I think, though it's taken off the battlefield a lot more terrorists than it has put on. The article rebuts this. At least the DCI is aware that if the attempted assassinations of 41 men by drones result in 1,147 people being killed, there exists the likelihood that the policy might be fanning the flames of war. Even if only one family member from each of those killed joins the insurgency or becomes radicalized, the DCI's estimate of taking more off the battlefield than it is put on is completely inaccurate. And it does elude the rather important observation that the CIA and the Army and the EIEIO, the torture programs that they ran in Iraq and in Afghanistan, was a leading cause of foreign fighters rushing in to battle the U.S., as it always is. It's what radicalized Qutb. It's what radicalized Zawahiri. You take people who are having intellectual arguments and discussions and want to address things reasonably, and you turn them into extremists because you torture them. And other people see that folks have been tortured, and how do you deal with torturers? Do you invite them to tea? No, you don't. Then Brennan goes on to say, it's been a long war, unfortunately, but it's been a war that has been in existence for millennia. What nonsense. So this is a great mythic war that's existed for thousands of years? Seriously? No, that's nonsense. But he cast it into this mythic space where it is both noble and it is timeless. It had no beginning, and guess what? It has no end. It has no end. So he goes on to say we can't kill our way out of this. We've got to address the issues, that underlying issues and conditions. Quote, I'm not saying that poverty causes somebody to become a terrorist or a lack of governance, but they certainly do allow these terrorist organizations to grow, and they take full advantage of those opportunities. So, okay, here we've got DCI refusing to acknowledge there could possibly be, in anyone's mind, anywhere, a legitimate policy issue. All right? So you say they don't have a legitimate policy issue. They are crazy people. They are monsters. They are subhuman. And so you initiate, propagate, maintain, and continue an endless war. As the author writes, by removing the possibility of changing the political climate. Without entertaining the idea for a policy shift, the only option left is war. Now think about this. If we're in this mythic space, it's not about policy, it's not about politics, it's some sort of mythic war against evil. This is an eternal war. Now we're back to Orwell, who wrote, "The war is not meant to be won. It is meant to be continuous. Hierarchical society is only possible on the basis of poverty and ignorance. The new version is the past, and no different past can have ever existed. In principle, the war effort is always planned to keep society on the brink of starvation. The war is waged by the ruling group against its own subjects, and its object is not victory over either Eurasia or East Asia, but to keep the very structure of society intact. And of course, the structure of society is an empire wherein the wars have become so expensive and the payoffs so minuscule that they've taken to cannibalizing their own citizens. And again, you can read this on Mint Press. So back to thinking about news here and the nature of news and the nature of ideas. And I said, what theories are they working with? Well, they're certainly not working with a theory of creating a space where people can discuss differences. Empires don't do that. And clearly, when we're talking about news, they're not speaking of what is sometimes referred to as the marketplace of ideas. Our ideas can't compete. Maybe we're marketing a product that has some value in domestic consumption, but the foreign markets are just not interested in consuming it. They are not swayed. They are not swayed. They're not convinced by our rhetoric. They're not convinced by our stories. They're not convinced by our news. And there was a time when people were at least inclined to consider that the U.S. was maybe saying something worthwhile, something true. But not now. So we fall back on the idea that the U.S. must put out more and better information and thus win the information wars. But the official information, this drivel peddled by the likes of Jan Psaki, the U.S. State Department spokesperson, and the bellicose wars of generals and the open imperialism of U.S. policy is really hard to ignore or to put a smiley face on. It really is. The official stories work well inside the U.S., but few outside the country believe our tales. And we can see this in things like the way people in the U.S. consider the ideas of the images of Arabs and Muslims in the American psyche, in the American mind, right? We have, Muslims are terrorists. Most of the attacks are Muslim terrorists. This is just absurd. This is just absurd. And it plays into a whole set of beliefs about Orientalism, about values, about race, and Christianity and Islam. This is a sub-issue. This is really not important. We keep thinking that anybody who's not the U.S. or Europe is inferior, is substandard, backward, stupid, undeveloped. And so we can cloak ourselves in this notion that we're once again shouldering the white man's burden to go out and bring the poor benighted brown and black folk of the world into civilization. But this is absurd. And if you look at the statistics on terror, if you look at the statistics on terror attacks, they don't at all suggest that Arabs commit most of the terror. But we think they do, because every time you look in a movie or look on TV and they need a terrorist, they've got an Arab. You betcha. You betcha they do. Yet in the U.S., terrorism by Muslims, in the FBI report recently said maybe 6%. Terrorism by Jewish people, about 7% of the terrorism. Terrorism by Hispanic people, of all things, and I presume they're talking about drug terror, is 42% of the cases. And then if we look at the countries where we have the greatest violence, right? If we have the greatest violence, it's always places where the insurrections, the civil wars, the power vacuums are a direct result, mostly, of U.S. interventions and our partners, of course. Somalia, Philippines, Thailand, Colombia, Turkey, Mali, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nepal. If you look at terror, these are 7th, 9th, 10th, 16th, 17th, 22nd, and 24th in the world. This is a fairly clear link to U.S. policies and U.S. interventions in these worlds, in these countries. If we look at places where the U.S. is directly involved, where NATO's involved, look at Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, Russia, Lebanon, Libya, DRC, Sudan, South Sudan, China, Iran, then what do we find? We find that in terms of terror, this list of countries ranks 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 7th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 15th, 18th, 19th, 20th, 25th, and 28th. U.S. wars, U.S. coups have created the conditions in all of these countries wherein terrorism could flourish. But we see an Arab commits terrorism, suddenly all Arabs are terrorists. This collective guilt, this belief that the one represents the whole, which is a really funny and sick and wrong and misleading idea. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Long Waves Radio on KYRS, and we're discussing the news coverage, if you will, if we can call it that, of various issues around the world and why the U.S. people are so staggeringly uninformed. You rarely see anything good about Muslims in the U.S. press. We just don't see much of that at all, do we? What we see is a savage, uncivilized people. The same trick we've used elsewhere. We used it in Latin America, Banana Land, they used to call it laughingly. We used the same story against the Native Americans. Savage, uncivilized, not quite human. We use the same story against the Moro in the Philippines. And it justified torture, murder, genocide, all of the things we're doing now. Once you say people are not people, you can do what you want to them if you're that kind of person. The same laws don't apply to us and them. The word dum-dum actually comes from the name. It's a kind of ammunition, for those of you who don't know. It's an old slang for hollow point ammunition that's designed to expand and make big, nasty wounds. And the word dum-dum comes from an ammunition factory in India, where the ammunition was manufactured by the British government. They wouldn't use it against Europeans. There were laws against it. There still are laws against the use of dum-dum ammunition in combat. But the English were quite happy to use it in the colonies, where they didn't feel pain in the same way, where because they were closer to animals, they were harder to stop. So in India, in China, in Africa, other parts of Asia. You could use dum-dums, but you couldn't use them on people. This speaks volumes about how the West has tended to see others. And this turning others into savages, uncivilized, subhuman, depoliticizes whatever issue is there. It's not politics that could be talked about. It's not an issue of governance that could be discussed. And in fact, many of the countries that the U.S. has knocked off have been fairly democratically elected. Right? We could think Morsi in Egypt recently. We could think Allende in Chile. We could think Arbenz. We could go down the list. Knocked off either because they were communists, meaning they cared more about their own people than they did about U.S. corporations, or because they were just crazy people. But there weren't actually issues that could be discussed reasonably. So we depoliticize the nature of the tensions and we sanitize the actions of the empire. According to Europol, 99.6% of all terrorist attacks in Europe recently, over a couple of years period, were by non-Muslims. 99.6. In the U.S., as I cited before, the FBI figures 6% of terrorist attacks or terrorist incidents were connected to Muslims, 7% were connected to Jews, 42% to Hispanics. Where's the outcry? Where's the war? Now, we just drag out the terrorist line when we've already decided we need a war or a proxy war, and then we can get involved in it, and it's not political. It's not us knocking over some country because we want their resources. It's not us knocking over some country because we want to control it and use it as a base or as a colony. It's terrorism, or it's inhumanity, or some awful nonsense like this, which plays real good in the sound bites on what passes for news in the United States. But really, nobody around the world believes this nonsense anymore. Not seriously. And the only time we seem to listen to the world is when it gangs up on us and threatens to embarrass us. Mark Weisbrot, writing in Venezuela Analysis, notes that in a sense, Obama was really kind of pressured into having to establish diplomatic relationships with Cuba. The last time there was a summit of the Americas in Colombia in 2012, there were nothing but scandals. They had the Secret Service agents having sex with prostitutes, and there was a rebellion from a lot of the countries about the failed U.S. war on drugs, and a unanimous opposition to the continuing U.S. embargo on Cuba. Right? But it wasn't just the usual suspects, writes Weisbrot. President Manuel Santos of Colombia, one of Washington's few friendlies in the region, said there would not be another summit without Cuba. So Obama offers up a Christmas surprise, writes Weisbrot. Obama offers up a Christmas surprise to its southern neighbors last year when after more than half a century of aggression against Cuba, he would finally begin to normalize relations. Welcome to the 21st century, finally. But the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. On March 9th, the White House declared a national emergency, and I talked about this on the show, due to the, quote, extraordinary threat to national security posed by Venezuela, blah, blah, blah. Like anybody believes that. And then all this tough talk about how this was just the beginning and there'd be more sanctions and more. But it wasn't anything about alleged human rights violations in Venezuela. Weisbrot continues, from 2000 to 2010, the Colombian military assassinated more than 5,700 civilians. the U.S. government contended to provide literally billions of dollars of military and police aid. In Honduras, the Obama administration took numerous steps to help ensure that the 2009 military coup against the democratically elected government of Mel Zelaya would succeed. And in Mexico, 43 students disappeared 6 months ago with the complicity of local authorities and police and possibly federal police and government as well. But the U.S. isn't even considering reducing military aid to Mexico. Oh, but Venezuela. Oh, wait, you just went Venezuela. Yes, sir. Right. But here's the kicker. Weisbrot points out that what the sanctions make clear and what the opening to Cuba makes clear is that they represent exactly zero change in Washington's overall strategy toward the region. Quote, the intention of expanding commercial and diplomatic relations with Cuba was mainly to pursue a more effective strategy of undermining the Cuban government and of all of the left governments in the region. This includes Brazil, where the U.S. State Department funded efforts to weaken the Workers' Party in 2005, the Workers' Party government. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, nearly every country in the Americas spoke out against the sanctions at the OAS just this month. The Union of South American Nations demanded their repeal. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which includes literally every country in the hemisphere except for the U.S. and Canada, voted for the repeal. But are we listening yet? If there is a country that is a threat to the Americas, it is the United States because it has permanently invaded countries, caused coup d'etat, and promoted dictatorships. That's from the Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Pantino. So, are we going to see a change? Are we going to see a change in Cuba, in South America? Not unless they keep hammering it home. Not unless they keep demonstrating that the behavior of a rogue state, the U.S., will not be tolerated by the civilized nations of the world. A little bit important, don't you think? So, Obama will go to the meeting, but the Broadcasting Board of Governors, they just don't have to worry at all. It's only going to be covered by the foreign press. And the U.S. press will either ignore the event completely or show a few pictures of our beloved president shaking hands and have a sound bite there they can play back to us. Our beloved president, leader of the free world, bringing democracy to the poor, benighted brown folk of Banana Land. And that's how it'll play back here, and nobody will pay any attention to it. The U.S. is so committed to its plans, it can't possibly alter them. And these plans can never be explained to the citizens of the United States or to the world. And so they indulge in the most staggering statements of nonsense in explaining these nonsensical actions. Right? Consider our allies, the Saudis, who are now promoting democracy in Yemen by removing the Houthis and bombing food and water and civilian targets, and trying to put their puppet back in the government, control of the government in Yemen. They even asked Pakistan to send over military forces. You believe this, right? Here's the bit. They asked Pakistan to send military forces to Saudi Arabia. Now, the Nation PK, it's a blog out of Pakistan, probably semi-official, asked some tough questions about this. For one thing, the Saudi Arabians said only Sunni soldiers could serve. Only Sunni soldiers and officers. Quoting the blog, I understand you want to believe the conflict in Yemen is justified and that our holy sites are threatened by Houthi rebels, but that's simply not the case. This is not a battle for the integrity of Saudi Arabia, but an expansionist power grab for them to reinstate their chosen leader. When you've spent the last 2 weeks telling the world that you want the Pakistan army involved in the conflict, or as the media have reported it, the Pakistan army wants to be involved, only to turn and demand that only Sunni officers and soldiers are sent to fight, you have to start to wonder what the greater game is here. The problem is that when you put our soldiers under command of the Saudi monarchy, as requested, our commanders are no longer the command unit for them. They take their orders from Riyadh, not from Rawalpindi. If they are ordered to storm Yemen, they must follow orders. But the game here is much larger, and we need to understand the context. And here's the context. Quote, in the past few months, the Pakistan Army, Pakistan Air Force, and SSG commandos have made great advances against the TTP and their affiliated organizations around the country. TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban, the Taliban. Now, extreme madrasas funded by foreign countries are where the Taliban were born, where the Taliban were radicalized, where the Taliban are trained. So now, quote, the army and population of Pakistan are united for the first time in many years to try to eliminate the scourge of terrorism and extremism. The Saudi are now trying to not only divide the population, but divide our army as well. Where did the Taliban come from? Where did these madrasas come from? They were funded by the Saudi royal family, who were exporting their extremists, the Wahhabi extremists, to other countries to get them out of the country, basically. And they funded them as far as Pakistan and as far as Morocco to go and set up mosques and teach Wahhabi teachings, extreme fundamentalist Sunni teachings. And this is what the Pakistanis have been fighting for a while. And now here, Saudi Arabia suddenly says, send us, a couple of companies of Sunni-only officers and soldiers to defend our holy sites, but it's not about defending holy sites. Please don't be fooled, he continues. Pakistan has paid with 80,000 innocent lives. These same countries that we are considering to protect today funded the killers. But when the media makes this case, ask yourself these. When we started our fight against terrorists, which one of these countries offered equipment, materials, or financial support to us? Which one stopped funding extremist madrasas and the groups they currently fund? Why are we being asked, the Pakistanis, why are we being asked to provide soldiers for a fight that has nothing to do with us? When did the Pakistan army become a mercenary force for hire to the highest bidder? Now, rest assured, this will never be covered in the U.S. news. Nobody will ever talk about it, except, a couple little weird sites like this one. But this is absolutely key because it reveals what's going on. The Saudis have been exporting extremism and funding it for yonks, a Saudi royal family. And Pakistan was one of the main places. Another was Iraq. So you've got this extremist force, well-funded, and then you want to take the Pakistan army to fight Shia and only take Sunni members of the Pakistan Army. This is a division of the Pakistan Army and a division of the Pakistani population. And it's pretty barefaced. If the Pakistanis do this, they will be in for a world of hurt. But as I say, there's a long history of this. And it won't be covered in the U.S. because, it's a complicated story. It undermines the dominant narrative. And it would bring our friends, the Israelis and the Saudis, into disrepute. And we can't do that. But at least we do have something we can talk about. Ukraine. We can talk about how the war is starting up again in Ukraine. And it's a catastrophe and a disaster. But just wait for the thumping of chess. I mean, the U.S. U.S. and NATO, which is, the leisure activity of the U.S. military. The U.S. and NATO are conducting operations all over Eastern Europe. Parachute operations, resupply operations. We got troops training other troops over there, and troops training the Ukrainian army, and probably some of the militias as well. But serious fighting has started again, right? The Associated Press says that on Sunday, the OSCE, the Organization of Security, blah, 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 in Europe, recorded at least 1,166 explosions one day. 1,166 explosions caused mainly by artillery and mortar shell strikes in northern Donetsk, as well as on the outskirts, including what used to be the airport. Intense mortar fire was reported near the Azov Sea, but the OSCE reps couldn't get there. And it's interesting, the AP doesn't report, and it doesn't say who or what started these battles. And this is really the key bit, and it's pointed out by Moon of Alabama. And if you want to read a smart blog on such issues, check out Moon of Alabama, written all as one word. Who started these battles? The AP says, quotes a Ukrainian representative, saying there's a highly emotional state and personal animosity between the fighters on both sides. So they just got riled up and started firing almost 1,200 artillery rounds at each other. No. Moon of Alabama writes, yeah, that's what a Ukrainian representative would probably say. What can we assume from that? The AP writers obviously read the OSCE report, but they leave out the key bit, which, of course, Moon of Alabama put in. Quote, both the Ukrainian Armed Forces representative and the Russian Federation representative told the SMM that the Ukrainian side, assessed to be the Right Sector Volunteer Battalion, Pravy Sektor, earlier had made an offensive push through the line of contact toward Zhabunki, which is a DPR-controlled area about 14 kilometers west-northwest of Donetsk. So, Nazis, these are real Nazis. Nazis from Pravy Sektor Azov Battalion attacked, broke the ceasefire, started the fighting. But if you're just relying on the AP to tell you what's happening, you're not going to hear this. You are not going to hear it. You're going to hear fighting broke out for some unexplained reason. The same way they're not going to tell you about all of the people who are being murdered in Ukraine. Right? 8 people so far found murdered in Ukraine. And initially, these are dismissed as suicides or something or other. But they were all tied to the former official, Viktor Yanukovych. They were all tied to him. Right? So Newsweek does a hatchet piece on them and claims that the person behind it is an oligarch named Rinat Akhmetov, who was a billionaire backer of Yanukovych's party. And Newsweek goes on to assert that Akhmetov had these people killed because they helped him when he acquired bribes, through bribes and violence, companies that the state privatized, and they knew too much. Wow. Well, that's quite a leap there for explanation without any evidence. But as the article points out, these people were involved in many privatizations, and not all of those went to Akhmetov. They were also loyal to Akhmetov, longtime servants of him, and there was no sign that they were changing sides or worked against him. He simply had no reason to kill them. Now, there are other oligarchs in Ukraine who had reasons to kill them, but that would just be too hard a story for Newsweek to tell. I remember hearing Victor Marchetti give a lecture, back in the mid-'70s. Victor Marchetti was a CIA agent. He was one of the first to go to, not defect, but to leave the agency and go public and start telling stories. And this was back in the 70s, so this was an act of extreme bravery. And Marchetti was going on about how the truth of these issues is never revealed. And he said, for instance, there's a major weekly news magazine that always prints what the company wants printed. It's not U.S. News and World Report. It's not Time. That's right. It's the other one. You can fill in the blanks yourself. And I didn't say that. Victor Marchetti did. This concludes today's show. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have ideas for a show, feel free to write me. longwaves@kyrs.org. You can find us on Facebook, Longwaves Radio, and I have links to the podcasts of these shows as well as links to some of the articles that I use. And if you've got some information you want to pass on to me and have me look at and maybe put on the air, feel free to pop it along. Thank you so much for listening. This is, I'll say it again, KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3. Thank you again for listening. Until next week, I'm gone.